Hi, I'm Carrie Severino. I'm president of JCN, and I'm here today with Tennessee's new Attorney General, Jonathan Skrmetti. He's been in the office for about 2 months now, and we actually have a long history, and I'm so excited to get a chance to see you again and to catch up and find out what you've been doing in your new role. So.
Well, yeah, it's great to see you, Carrie. We sat together in some of our 1L classes way back when, and it's a delight to get a chance to talk to you again. It's been a very busy 2 months. Tennessee has a great Attorney General's office. There are a lot of fights to be fought, and so we've been busy trying to get up to speed on a number of fronts. And we're working on recruiting some new people, working on restructuring the office with the help of the governor and the General Assembly to let us better defend the interests of the people of Tennessee.
Yeah, so you come from being the second in the office. How has that transition been? So you obviously know the office well. Is it hard? How hard is it to step in and suddenly be the boss?
It's harder than I expected, actually. I was the chief deputy for 3 years, and then I took a brief stint in the governor's office working as his chief counsel. And when I went back to the Attorney General's office, there had been a few little changes, but by and large things were the same. And I had not realized just how much managerial work there was with respect to the non-legal parts of the office. So that was the biggest surprise. Just a lot of management function. The upside is I'm able to very clearly define the priorities of the office, make sure that we're getting involved in all the cases that I'm most interested in, and we're able to leverage our resources and our exceptionally talented attorney team to serve the interests of the people.
Yeah. So when we first met each other, in law school, one of the things that we were doing together was the Federalist Society, an event. So you have deeper roots at the Federalist Society than I think many state attorney generals do, having worked with Journal of Law and Public Policy as the editor back then. How has that helped you in your current role, and what advice maybe do you have for, it sounds like you have a talented team, but if you're looking to hire people or looking at the up-and-coming lawyers, how do you see that working?
Well, I think the most important thing about the Federalist Society is it's a debating society. It's not an indoctrination society. And it's a lot of people who care about the deep fundamental elements of the rule of law. So looking at the way our government is organized with the federal government and separation of powers at the federal level, with the state governments and the separation of powers at the state level, understanding that the concentration of power is the great evil to be avoided, and looking past some of the substantive conflicts we have. I mean, people are going to disagree about laws. They're always going to have these disagreements. Laws will change. We've got the Constitution establishing the structure and the limitations on the federal government. And just thinking about what it means that we have this system and what the threats might be that will undermine a system that's worked very, very well for America for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and with the Biden administration in place now, I think the attorney generals of the states have a real role in policing those separation of powers. So what do you see the big areas that you're going to need to be that key factor in the separation of powers in the federal system, making sure that the federal government doesn't overreach?
So the fundamental lawmaking process in our country is Congress makes the laws. The executive branch has some interstitial authority to determine how it will enforce the laws that Congress passes, but Congress makes the law. And we've had some legislative challenges. People have had a hard time compromising and moving legislation through, and as a result, everyone's looking for shortcuts. And in the old days, the shortcut was judicial activism, where the courts would just say the law means this because it's what we want it to mean. Over the course of a generation, I think we've largely won that fight. But now the fight has to do with what the administrative state's doing, and you have regulators coming in the executive branch, and they're purportedly interpreting the laws, but what they're really trying to do is rewrite them. And so the state AGs are in a strong position to call out that behavior, to enjoin the bad conduct, to get the courts to step in and remind the executive branch of our constitutional system.
And is that something that you have relationships with the other state AGs and are working on together?
Absolutely. It is a very busy environment, and so we do a lot of tag teaming and splitting up responsibilities. They're a very active group of Republican attorneys general, and we are used to having certain people take the lead in different areas. So in Tennessee, we're doing a lot of the Title IX work and the related regulatory work about the redefinition of sex discrimination that the administration's been engaged in, and pushing back against that. And then we're working hard on some of the ESG-related issues as well. But there are other states that are taking other elements of federal overreach and pushing back. And it's a resource issue. One state by itself has a hard time fighting back against all of the federal overreach because the federal government has a great many more lawyers than any given state.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the Title IX one, because that's one that you, right out of the gate, were involved in, and that you really are the lead state on that issue.
Sure. So, and this is something that my predecessor originally initiated, but I'm certainly glad to keep fighting the fight. And that is, you've got an executive order from, I believe, day one of the Biden administration saying to every federal agency, you're going to redefine your rules to ensure that the rules that you've had covering sex discrimination are going to cover discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And at first, they were doing this through guidance, which is a completely illegitimate method where the agency literally just says, here's what we think the law means. And of course, if you're downstream of that, if you're a regulated entity, you're going to treat that like it's the law, even if it's procedurally completely invalid. Now we're seeing proposed rules coming out that are trying to more formally enact the original executive order. But this is all beyond the scope of the authorizing statute. And again, in our system, Congress makes the laws. When the executive branch tries to make the laws, the states need to push back, and private parties need to push back to ensure that the integrity of our system is maintained.
Yeah. So one of the things that's different with you and a lot of the other attorney generals is you weren't elected by the people, you weren't appointed by a governor. How talk a little bit about how you got to this position, and maybe how that affects the way you approach your attorney general.
Sure.
Spot.
So I heard this from one of my predecessors over the weekend. There are 50 attorneys general representing the United States. 44 are elected, 5 are appointed, and 1 is anointed. And I am the anointed one. Our Supreme Court picks the attorney general. It's been that way since, I believe, 1870. And we have a 5-member court. They did public interviews. They took applications. And I was very fortunate to get selected. What it typically means is we have people who are focused on the law, who are really interested in being the attorney general. It's never been a stepping stone to the governor's office in Tennessee. The one time somebody tried it, he came in 7th in the election, in the primary. So you tend to get people who are a little bit, for lack of a better word, nerdier, who are really law-oriented people. And that certainly describes me. And
Nerd in chief.
Nerd in chief, that's right. I'll claim that title.
All right. So one of the themes that it seems like has been important to you is First Amendment issues and freedom of speech and open debate. And how do you envision that theme going through some of your priorities as Attorney General? So
I think it's one of the most fundamental freedoms that we have, and it is critically important that we collectively, not as a partisan matter, but just every American, defend the right to speak freely. That's how we make good decisions as a democratic country. We've seen a number of threats to this. The threat that I responded to, that I think you're alluding to, is when the American Medical Association and several other groups asked the United States Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute people who were threatening pediatric transgender clinics, were committing violence against pediatric transgender clinics. And of course, those two things are absolutely appropriate. Yeah. But also to investigate and prosecute those who provoked threats. And that's a very open-ended mandate there, essentially saying if people are saying things that are making people mad, you need to crack down on them. Well, it is so inappropriate that I'm troubled that the request was even made. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we step up and remind the federal government and remind everybody participating in our system, people have the right to disagree with you. And that is a hill that we all need to be willing to die on. Yeah, and that's certainly something when we were in law school together that is really important. When you are a minority voice on campus, you want to be able to have the right to
free speech, and we want that for everyone in society.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if you're in the majority, you need to hear what the critiques are. You need to understand what the weaknesses are in your position. You may not change your mind, but at least you'll know that you've been given the opportunity to test your ideas.
Yeah. So you alluded to some of your ESG work earlier as well. How does that tie in with your concerns about First Amendment rights?
Well, it's a concentration of power issue. We live in a world now where so much of the conversation is online, where you have a few giant companies providing the mechanism by which people communicate ideas, by which families stay connected. So much of our just day-to-day interrelationships happen via a few very large, very powerful companies. And if those companies decide to put a thumb on the scale and manipulate the way the conversation is proceeding, that has terrible effects on our day-to-day life and on the proper functioning of our government, because our government is predicated on people exchanging ideas, debating, persuading one another. So the tech companies are one of the avenues in which ESG is important. And ESG, I think, is a poor term for what we're looking at. It was the tip of the spear that people started paying attention to with certain large financial companies pursuing these environmental, social, and governance incentives. But really, it's a problem of oligarchy. It's people who have huge market power who are attempting to enact social policies by leveraging that power. And that is just fundamentally un-American. There's no problem with people being successful. There's no problem with companies being big. But if you've got a bunch of big companies whose owners get together and say, we don't like that people have the right to purchase firearms, we're going to make it really hard for them to do that. Well, it's not a matter of one person making a decision there. It's a matter of market actors colluding against the interests of consumers. And that is not something that we're going to tolerate, and we have the tools to fight back against that.
So what tools are you able to use to get at that? Because that's a huge problem. It's almost, in some ways, a similar issue to the separation of powers things you were talking about as well, where it's like we need to have these different forces and not everyone, colluding in the same side on something. So how do you plan to attack that
Absolutely.
big problem?
And it's a very similar problem with respect to the federal overreach. We have the U.S. Constitution. With respect to corporate misconduct, we have consumer protection laws and we have antitrust laws. And if companies are colluding in ways that hurt the consumers and reduce competition, antitrust laws are tools for that. If we have companies that are making misrepresentations as to the value of the products they're providing, if they say, we're going to give you an open environment to talk about whatever you want, and that's not really describing how it actually works in practice, that might be a consumer protection violation. We've been doing these cases for a long time. I think you haven't seen companies as ambitious about overreaching in the past, but the tried and true tools of the attorneys general fit squarely into the problem we're trying to solve.
It's great. We got use the same good old-fashioned tools, and each problem changes with with the generation.
That's right.
Are there any other? We talked about a lot of really important objectives that you're aiming at. Any other top issues that you want to have as your goals in the next few years here?
I'm really interested in consumer protection generally, not just in the ESG context, but this is another thing that state AGs have done forever, looking at antitrust issues involving the tech companies that aren't related to censorship, but just are generally related to anti-consumer conduct. Looking at consumer protection issues with respect to the representations that have been made by some of the social media companies, and some of the particularly social media issues affecting children. There's a bipartisan multi-state effort to really delve into that, look at what the companies knew, how they reacted as they learned about the addictive and mental health damaging elements of their products. And there has to be transparency there. That's the antidote. And there has to be accountability for bad actors.
So just on that note, I think we've seen a real push in a lot of areas toward various prosecutors at different levels maybe selectively or not prosecuting crimes, and what tools do you have as an attorney general to make sure that that's not something that's going to be having a big factor in Tennessee? I know I have friends in this area who have said, gosh, I can't live in this neighborhood anymore because the local DA is not even prosecuting anything short of murder, and it's a real problem, the increase in crime as a result.
Absolutely.
I know you have a long background in actually helping prosecute crime. So.
I know a little bit about crime. It's a huge problem, and there are two massive criminal justice problems out there. The first is the under-enforcement of the law in ways that hurt everybody. The poor, the most vulnerable in society, are the most affected by police and prosecutors who aren't protecting their neighborhoods. Separately, there's a problem with double standards where you have politically motivated prosecutions that swing back and forth based on what the people being prosecuted believe. We need to look at both of those. My office doesn't have a lot of original criminal jurisdiction. What we do is back up the line prosecutors in the DA's offices. We handle all the criminal appeals, and we can lend resources to help with particularly complicated issues. If there's a prosecution that implicates First Amendment concerns, the DAs who are out there prosecuting violent crimes don't have the time to dig in and figure out the nuance. We can help with that. I was speaking with our District Attorney General's conference recently, and one thing we can do is encourage them. They need to know that someone out there has their back. We've got a governor that's making resources available to local police. We've got a legislature that's looking at sentencing regimes in Tennessee. They're all clients of mine. I can give them good advice and encouragement. Certainly to the maximal extent my office allows, I want to be part of fighting against crime and protecting the people.
Yeah. Anything else people need to know about what they have to expect from their new Attorney General?
We're hiring.
All
so
right,
if there are
great.
any younger lawyers or experienced litigators who want to work on really meaningful and important cases that are going to significantly affect society, that are going to change the way that their children are raised in terms of changing the country that they're in, they should come work for the Tennessee Attorney General's office.
Awesome. Well, I definitely have seen, just in the past decade or so, the rise of importance in state attorney general's offices and how significant a role they play in defending our constitutional structure and making sure the state is running well. So I'm very excited to have you heading one up. I never thought we would come from torts class to end up here. But
Amen.
It's a pretty exciting development. So congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
As you get going.
Thank you. It's great talking with you.
Good talking to you.